Amsterdam, 1670. In a modest workshop on the outskirts of the city, the rhythmic sound of glass against metal creates a meditation on precision and patience. Baruch Spinoza sits hunched over his grinding wheel, shaping optical lenses with the same methodical care he applies to philosophical problems. Each lens must be perfect, free from distortion, transparent to light, capable of revealing truth rather than creating illusion. The irony is not lost on him that a man excommunicated for his ideas now makes his living helping others see more clearly. The workshop is sparse but orderly, reflecting the mind of its occupant. Tools arranged with mathematical precision, notebooks filled with geometric proofs, and everywhere the quiet evidence of a life lived according to reason rather than passion. At 37, Spinoza has already been cast out from the Jewish community of Amsterdam, declared dead to his family, forbidden from speaking to former friends. Yet his face shows no trace of bitterness or regret. Instead, there is a quality of profound calm, as if he has discovered some secret about existence that makes external circumstances irrelevant to inner peace. He pauses in his work to examine the lens taking shape under his hands. Light passes through it without distortion, revealing objects as they truly are rather than as we wish them to be. This transparency has become his philosophical ideal, to see reality without the colored filters of hope, fear, superstition, or wishful thinking, to understand the world as it actually operates rather than as religious tradition or human emotion suggests it should operate. The lens in his hand represents more than a commercial product. It embodies a revolutionary approach to human existence. Just as this piece of glass reveals the physical world with unprecedented clarity, his philosophical system promises to reveal the true nature of mind, reality, and human happiness with equal precision. But unlike the scientists who use his lenses to peer into the heavens, Spinoza turns his analytical gaze inward, examining the very foundations of consciousness, emotion, and ethical behavior. This is not merely a philosopher earning his living through manual labor. This is the crystallization of a worldview that sees no fundamental distinction between physical and mental reality, between understanding nature and understanding human nature, between the laws that govern falling stones and the principles that should guide human conduct. In this small workshop, one of history's most radical philosophical systems is taking shape alongside the optical instruments that make it financially possible. Consider the audacity of what he is attempting. In an age when religious authority still dominates European intellectual life, when questioning God's nature can result in torture or execution, when the very idea of systematic doubt about sacred beliefs is considered not just wrong, but evil, Spinoza is developing a philosophy that treats everything, including God, human nature, and moral law, as subject to the same rational analysis that applies to geometry or physics. The pages of his notebooks contain ideas that will not be fully understood or accepted for centuries. That everything that exists is part of a single substance. He identifies with both God and nature. That human emotions are natural phenomena that can be analyzed and managed through reason. That freedom comes not from the ability to make arbitrary choices, but from understanding the necessity that governs all existence. That the highest human happiness consists in a kind of intellectual love that transcends the ordinary distinctions between self and world. But perhaps most radically, he is working out these ideas not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as practical guides for living. Every lens he grinds, every page he writes, every moment of his carefully structured life demonstrates his conviction that philosophical truth should make real difference in how human beings experience existence. He is not seeking fame, wealth, or power, all of which he has consciously rejected, but something far more precious, a way of being in the world that is immune to the external circumstances that make most people miserable. The afternoon light shifts in his workshop, and he returns to his grinding. Each motion is deliberate, unhurried, perfect. There is no anxiety about the future, no regret about the past, only complete absorption in the present task. He has achieved something that philosophers had theorized about for centuries, but rarely demonstrated: genuine equanimity based not on ignorance of life's difficulties, but on profound understanding of why those difficulties exist and how they can be transcended through reason. To understand how this remarkable serenity emerged from a life marked by persecution, exile, and intellectual isolation, we must journey back to the Amsterdam Jewish community, where a brilliant young man first began to ask questions that would ultimately cost him everything he had been taught to value and give him something far more valuable in return: The Portuguese Jewish community of 17th century Amsterdam represented one of Europe's most remarkable experiments in religious tolerance and intellectual freedom. These were not the Ashkenazi Jews who had fled medieval persecutions in Germany and Eastern Europe, but Sephardic families who had maintained their traditions in secret during centuries of Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition before finally finding refuge in the Dutch Republic's atmosphere of relative religious liberty. Into this community of survivors and secret keepers was born, on November 24, 1632, Baruch Spinoza, a name that meant blessed in Hebrew, though the blessing would prove more complicated than his parents could have imagined. His father, Miguel de Spinoza, was a successful merchant who had helped build the economic foundations of the Amsterdam Sephardic community. His mother, Hannah Deborah, died when Baruch was only 6, leaving him to be raised within the tight-knit network of relatives and family friends who constituted the social world of the Portuguese Jews. This community had developed a distinctive culture that combined traditional Jewish religious observance with the intellectual sophistication that came from having lived, however precariously, within Christian European society for generations. Unlike many Jewish communities that had turned inward in response to persecution, the Amsterdam Sephardim maintained extensive contacts with the broader intellectual life of their time. They were familiar with contemporary developments in philosophy, science, and theology, even as they remained committed to preserving the religious traditions that had sustained them through centuries of oppression. Young Baruch's education reflected this cultural complexity. At the community's religious school, Etzheim Tree of Life, he studied Hebrew, Torah, Talmud, and the medieval Jewish philosophical tradition that had produced figures like Maimonides and Gersonides. But he also encountered the works of contemporary Christian philosophers and scientists, learned Latin and mathematics, and absorbed the rationalist approach to knowledge that was transforming European intellectual life. His teachers recognized exceptional intellectual ability from an early age. Baruch displayed not only remarkable memory and analytical skill, but an independence of mind that sometimes troubled his instructors. He asked difficult questions about religious doctrine, challenged traditional interpretations of sacred texts, and showed more interest in philosophical reasoning than in ritual observance. These characteristics might have been merely precocious in a different context. Within a community still vulnerable to external persecution, they represented potential danger. The Amsterdam Jewish community's relationship with Dutch Protestant authorities was based on a delicate understanding. Religious toleration would be maintained as long as Jews remained discreet about their beliefs and practices, contributed to the city's economic prosperity, and avoided theological controversies that might create political difficulties. Within this framework, community leaders had strong incentives to suppress forms of religious speculation that might be interpreted as threatening to Christian orthodoxy or social stability. But intellectual curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to constrain, particularly in a mind as powerful and independent as young Spinoza's. His studies in mathematics and the new experimental science convinced him that the rational methods being applied to understanding the natural world could also illuminate questions about God, human nature, and moral obligation. If geometric reasoning could reveal eternal truths about spatial relationships, why couldn't similar reasoning reveal eternal truths about theological and ethical questions? This conviction led him to begin developing what would become his distinctive philosophical method, the application of mathematical rigor to metaphysical and moral questions. Instead of accepting religious authority as the foundation for beliefs about God and human nature, he began examining these beliefs as hypotheses that could be tested through logical analysis and empirical observation. The results of this examination would prove revolutionary and, for his community, catastrophic. The intellectual ferment of 17th century Europe provided the broader context for Spinoza's developing philosophical interests. Galileo's telescopic observations had challenged traditional cosmology. Descartes had demonstrated the power of systematic doubt as a philosophical method, and Hobbes had begun applying scientific reasoning to questions of political and moral philosophy. These developments created both opportunities and dangers for religious communities that had based their authority on revealed truth, rather than rational demonstration. For young Spinoza, this intellectual environment was intoxicating. Here were methods for understanding reality that did not depend on tradition, authority, or faith, but on reason's capacity to discover truth through careful analysis of evidence and logical argument. The possibility of developing a comprehensive philosophical system based entirely on rational demonstration seemed not only attractive, but necessary for anyone committed to intellectual honesty. But such intellectual honesty came with costs that he was only beginning to understand. The rational analysis of religious beliefs inevitably led to conclusions that contradicted traditional teachings about God's nature, human destiny, and moral obligation. These contradictions might be manageable for individual philosophers working within Christian cultures that had developed sophisticated traditions of scholastic reasoning, but they posed existential threats to minority communities whose survival depended on maintaining clear boundaries between their beliefs and those of the surrounding society. The stage was thus set for a conflict between intellectual integrity and communal loyalty, between the demands of reason and the requirements of social belonging, between the individual pursuit of truth and the collective need for survival. Young Baruch Spinoza, brilliant and fearless in his commitment to following arguments wherever they led, was about to discover that some truths come at prices that few are willing to pay. Chapter 1. Questions begin. The first signs of intellectual rebellion appeared during Spinoza's teenage years, when his exceptional academic performance at a time was accompanied by increasingly troubling questions about the fundamental assumptions of Jewish religious belief. Unlike typical adolescent skepticism, which usually focuses on practical rules and social expectations, Baruch's doubts concerned the deepest theological and metaphysical foundations of the tradition he had been raised to accept without question. His studies in medieval Jewish philosophy, particularly the works of Maimonides, had introduced him to the idea that religious faith and rational philosophy could be harmonized through careful interpretation of sacred texts and systematic analysis of theological questions. But instead of resolving his doubts, these sophisticated theological arguments often raised new questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers within traditional frameworks. The problem began with the nature of God itself. Traditional Jewish theology taught that God was absolutely transcendent, completely separate from and superior to the created world. Yet the philosophical arguments he encountered suggested that an absolutely transcendent being could not interact with or influence the material world without compromising its transcendence. If God was truly infinite and perfect, how could it create anything finite and imperfect without diminishing itself? If God was unchanging and eternal, how could it respond to human prayers or intervene in historical events? These questions led to others that were even more troubling. If God foreknew all future events, how could human beings possess genuine free will? If divine providence governed all occurrences, how could human actions be genuinely moral or immoral? If God was perfectly just and benevolent, why did righteous people suffer while wicked people prospered? The standard theological answers to these questions seemed to Baruch either logically contradictory or emotionally unsatisfying. His introduction to contemporary Christian philosophy, particularly the works of René Descartes, provided new analytical tools, but also deepened his doubts about traditional religious beliefs. Cartesian dualism, which distinguished sharply between mental and material substance, seemed to make the relationship between soul and body as mysterious as the relationship between God and world. If mind and matter were entirely different kinds of substance, how could they interact? How could immaterial souls control material bodies or be affected by physical sensations? The new experimental science, being developed by figures like Galileo and Francis Bacon, suggested that natural phenomena could be understood entirely through mechanical causation, without reference to divine purposes or supernatural intervention. If the movement of planets, the behavior of falling objects, and the circulation of blood could all be explained through natural laws operating according to mathematical principles, why should human behavior require different types of explanation? Why should moral and psychological phenomena be exempt from the scientific understanding that was proving so successful in other domains? These intellectual developments occurred within the context of his practical education in his father's importing business, where he learned about international commerce, developed skills in multiple languages, and gained first-hand experience of how different cultures approached questions of religion, ethics, and social organization. This exposure to cultural diversity reinforced his growing sense that the beliefs and practices of his own community were historically contingent rather than eternally necessary. More troubling was his growing awareness that many respected members of the community privately harbored doubts similar to his own, but felt unable to express them openly without risking social ostracism and economic catastrophe. The pressure to maintain outward conformity while experiencing inner conflict created a form of psychological tension that seemed to him both unnecessary and ultimately destructive. His exceptional academic performance had positioned him to become a rabbi or community leader, roles that would have required him to teach and defend beliefs that his rational analysis was making increasingly difficult to accept. The prospect of spending his life professionally advocating positions he privately considered false or meaningless struck him as a form of intellectual prostitution that would corrupt both his own integrity and his potential contribution to human understanding. The conflict between intellectual honesty and social belonging reached a crisis point during his early 20s, when his philosophical studies had convinced him that traditional religious beliefs were not merely questionable, but actively harmful to human flourishing. Religion's emphasis on transcendent rewards and punishments seemed to prevent people from developing realistic understanding of their actual situation and possibilities. Religious morality's focus on divine commands rather than rational principles seemed to obstruct the development of genuine ethical insight based on understanding human nature and social requirements. But perhaps most seriously, religious thinking's reliance on authority, tradition, and revelation seemed to discourage the kind of independent rational inquiry that was proving so fruitful in other areas of human investigation. If human beings possess the capacity to understand mathematical truths, scientific laws, and logical relationships through the use of reason, why should they accept religious claims that could not be similarly demonstrated or verified? These questions were not merely academic for someone in Spinoza's position. The Amsterdam Jewish community's survival strategy depended on maintaining clear religious and cultural boundaries that distinguished Jews from the surrounding Christian population. Philosophical skepticism about religious authority threatened not just individual belief, but the collective identity that made community life possible and meaningful. The young man who had been considered one of the community's most promising scholars was becoming one of its most dangerous critics. The questions he was asking could not be answered satisfactorily within traditional frameworks, but neither could they be ignored or suppressed indefinitely. The stage was set for a confrontation between individual intellectual integrity and collective religious authority that would transform both Spinoza's life and the history of philosophy. Chapter 2: The Heretical Mind. By the early 1650s, Spinoza's philosophical development had reached a point where maintaining even the appearance of religious orthodoxy became increasingly difficult. His private studies had led him to conclusions that were not merely skeptical about particular religious doctrines, but fundamentally incompatible with the entire framework of traditional theism. He was developing what would eventually become one of history's most systematic critiques of anthropomorphic religion and supernatural thinking. The foundation of his emerging philosophy was what he would later call substance monism, the idea that everything that exists is part of a single, eternal, infinite substance that operates according to necessary natural laws. This substance he identified with both God and nature deus sive natura, but it was a God entirely different from the personal, transcendent deity of traditional Judaism and Christianity. His God did not create the world from nothing, did not intervene in natural processes, did not respond to prayers, and did not judge human actions according to moral standards. Instead, this God or nature was the immanent cause of all existence, the eternal and infinite reality within which all finite things existed and operated according to mathematical necessity. Human beings were not special creations made in God's image, but natural phenomena whose thoughts, emotions, and behaviors could be understood through the same analytical methods that applied to any other aspects of reality. This philosophical position had radical implications for traditional religious practices and beliefs. If everything occurred according to natural necessity, then prayer was meaningless as an attempt to influence divine behavior. If God was identical with nature rather than separate from it, then miracles were impossible, violations of natural law rather than signs of divine power. If human beings were entirely natural phenomena, then concepts like sin, divine punishment, and supernatural salvation were based on fundamental misunderstandings about human nature and cosmic reality. Perhaps most troubling for his religious community, Spinoza's analysis suggested that the Hebrew scriptures should be understood as historical documents reflecting the beliefs and experiences of ancient peoples, rather than as literally true revelations of divine will. The anthropomorphic language used to describe God in biblical texts reflected the limited understanding of pre-scientific cultures, rather than accurate knowledge about the nature of ultimate reality. This approach to biblical interpretation, which would later be developed in his theological political treatise, treated religious texts as proper subjects for the same kinds of historical and literary analysis that scholars applied to other ancient documents. Instead of assuming that apparent contradictions or scientific inaccuracies in Scripture must be explained away through ingenious interpretative strategies, this approach acknowledged that ancient texts naturally reflected the knowledge and perspectives available to their original authors. The implications extended beyond theoretical questions to practical matters of ethics and social organization. If human nature was entirely natural rather than supernatural, then moral philosophy should be based on rational understanding of human psychology and social requirements rather than divine commands transmitted through religious authority. If human happiness and suffering were natural phenomena, then ethical systems should focus on understanding and promoting the natural conditions that supported human flourishing, rather than preparing souls for supernatural rewards and punishments. Spinoza's growing philosophical sophistication was accompanied by increasing alienation from the religious community that had shaped his early development. His attendance at synagogue services became irregular, his participation in religious discussions grew more critical and challenging, and his association with known skeptics and freethinkers became more open and frequent. Community leaders who had once considered him a promising young scholar began viewing him as a potential threat to religious authority and social stability. The economic dimension of his situation complicated these intellectual conflicts. His family's importing business provided financial support that made his philosophical studies possible, but it also created obligations to maintain the social relationships that sustained commercial success. The Amsterdam Sephardic community was small and closely interconnected. Business relationships, family ties, religious obligations, and social expectations were thoroughly intertwined in ways that made selective conformity or discrete nonconformity extremely difficult. His friendship with other intellectually inclined young men who shared his philosophical interests provided some support for his developing ideas, but also increased suspicion about his religious orthodoxy. Figures like Juan de Prado and Daniel Ribera were known for their skeptical views and unconventional lifestyles. Association with such people suggested that Spinoza's intellectual independence was connected to broader patterns of religious and social nonconformity that community leaders had good reasons to discourage. The psychological tension of maintaining outward conformity while developing inner convictions that contradicted everything his community officially believed created a form of existential stress that was becoming unbearable. Every religious service required him to participate in rituals based on beliefs he considered false. Every family gathering involved discussions that presupposed theological assumptions he had rejected. Every business meeting occurred within social frameworks that depended on religious and cultural solidarities he no longer shared. Yet the alternative to this uncomfortable conformity seemed to be complete social isolation and economic disaster. The Amsterdam Jewish community was the only social world he had ever known. His family, friends, business associates, and potential marriage partners all existed within this community. Rejection by the community would mean not just intellectual freedom, but comprehensive exile from all the relationships and opportunities that had defined his life thus far. The conflict between intellectual integrity and social belonging was approaching a crisis point that would require him to make fundamental choices about what mattered most for a life worth living. The philosophical insights he was developing suggested that genuine human happiness required understanding and accepting reality as it actually was, rather than as one wished it to be. But applying this insight to his own situation would require sacrifices that few people had ever been willing to make. Chapter 3. Excommunication. The confrontation that had been building for years finally erupted in the summer of 1656, when the Amsterdam Sephardic community issued one of the most comprehensive and severe excommunication orders in Jewish history. The harem ban pronounced against 23-year-old Baruch Spinoza was not merely a religious censure, but a declaration of complete social death, designed to sever all connections between the young philosopher and the community that had shaped his entire existence. The immediate trigger for this drastic action remains historically unclear. Some accounts suggest that Spinoza had been reported to community authorities for making blasphemous statements about the nature of God, and the authority of Scripture. Others indicate that he had been offering private instruction in philosophy that included ideas incompatible with religious orthodoxy. Still others suggest that the community had learned of a formal complaint against him filed with civil authorities by someone seeking to damage his reputation for financial or personal reasons. What is clear is that by 1656, Spinoza's philosophical views had become impossible to reconcile with even the most liberal interpretations of Jewish religious belief. His developing system treated traditional theological concepts as psychological phenomena rather than metaphysical truths, analyzed religious practices as social customs rather than divine obligations, and approached sacred texts as historical documents rather than revealed wisdom. These positions were not merely heterodox. They challenged the fundamental assumptions that made religious community life possible. The text of the excommunication order, preserved in the archives of the Amsterdam Portuguese synagogue, reveals the community's deep anxiety about the threat that Spinoza's ideas posed to religious authority and social cohesion. The language is unusually harsh and comprehensive, cursing him with the anathema with which Joshua ben Jericho, and declaring him accursed by day and accursed by night, accursed when he lies down and accursed when he rises up. More significantly, the order required all members of the community to avoid any form of social, commercial, or intellectual contact with the excommunicated man. No one was permitted to speak with him, conduct business with him, read his writings, or provide him with any form of assistance. Even family members were forbidden from maintaining relationships with him. The goal was complete isolation designed to force repentance through comprehensive social and economic pressure. The community offered Spinoza an opportunity to avoid this fate by publicly repenting of his errors and committing himself to orthodox belief and practice. According to some accounts, they even offered him an annual pension if he would agree to maintain outward conformity, while keeping his philosophical views private. This proposal reflected the community's recognition that his intellectual abilities could be valuable if properly channeled, as well as their understanding that enforced conformity might be more practical than genuine conversion. Spinoza's response to these offers demonstrated the depth of his commitment to intellectual integrity over social belonging. He refused all opportunities for compromise, apparently concluding that a life based on conscious deception about his deepest convictions would be worse than the social and economic isolation that honest expression of those convictions would require. This decision reflected not just personal courage, but philosophical conviction about the relationship between authenticity and human flourishing. The psychological impact of excommunication on someone raised within a tight-knit religious community can hardly be overestimated. Overnight, Spinoza lost not only his religious identity, but his family relationships, friendship networks, business connections, and social support systems. The community that had been his entire world declared him dead and forbidden all future contact with him. For most people, such comprehensive rejection would have been psychologically devastating. Yet Spinoza's response suggests that his philosophical development had already prepared him for this crisis. His rational analysis of human emotions had convinced him that suffering often resulted from attachment to external circumstances beyond individual control. His understanding of deterministic causation had led him to accept what could not be changed while focusing energy on what remained within his power. His conception of human freedom as consisting in rational understanding rather than arbitrary choice had provided resources for maintaining dignity in circumstances that might have crushed someone with different philosophical convictions. The excommunication also liberated him from the psychological tension that had been making his life increasingly difficult. No longer did he need to maintain outward conformity while harboring inner convictions that contradicted community beliefs. No longer did he need to worry about the social consequences of intellectual honesty. The complete break with his religious community created space for authentic philosophical development, unconstrained by considerations of social acceptability. The practical consequences were nevertheless severe. Excommunication meant economic isolation at a time when commercial success depended heavily on trust relationships within religious and ethnic communities. It meant social isolation for someone whose entire network of personal relationships existed within the community that had rejected him. It meant cultural isolation from the traditions, practices, and shared meanings that had provided structure and significance for his daily life. But perhaps most importantly, The excommunication transformed Spinoza from a critic of religious authority into a living symbol of intellectual freedom. His willingness to accept comprehensive social ostracism rather than compromise his philosophical convictions demonstrated the practical possibility of choosing rational integrity over conventional belonging. This example would inspire generations of later thinkers who faced similar conflicts between truth and conformity. The young man who walked away from the Amsterdam Portuguese synagogue after the pronouncement of the Herem was no longer Baruch, the blessed son of the community, but Benedict, the Latinized version of his name, the philosopher whose commitment to reason had cost him everything except his intellectual freedom. This freedom, he was about to discover, was more valuable than anything he had lost. Chapter 4. Philosophical Independence. The period immediately following excommunication might have been expected to devastate a young man cut off from all familial and social support, but for Spinoza, it became a time of unprecedented intellectual creativity and personal liberation. Freed from the necessity of maintaining even superficial conformity to religious orthodoxy, he could finally develop his philosophical system without constraint or compromise. The social isolation that would have destroyed someone less committed to intellectual independence became the foundation for one of history's most systematic and revolutionary philosophical achievements. He established himself in a modest rented room outside Amsterdam, supporting himself through tutoring in Latin, mathematics, and philosophy. This work provided not only financial independence, but opportunities to refine his ideas through teaching, as explaining complex philosophical concepts to students required him to clarify and systematize his own thinking. His reputation as an exceptional teacher soon attracted students from various backgrounds, including Christians curious about Jewish learning and free-thinking intellectuals interested in his unconventional philosophical approach. The intellectual freedom of his new situation allowed him to pursue systematic study of contemporary philosophy, particularly the works of René Descartes, whose methodical approach to philosophical problems provided a model for the geometric method that Spinoza would apply to metaphysical and ethical questions. But where Descartes had maintained traditional beliefs about God, soul, and moral obligation alongside his innovative philosophical method, Spinoza applied rational analysis consistently to all aspects of existence, without exempting any beliefs from logical scrutiny. The systematic application of reason to traditional philosophical problems led to conclusions that were far more radical than those reached by other contemporary thinkers. His analysis of substance, causation, and necessity convinced him that the distinction between God and nature was conceptually confused and practically harmful. If God was truly infinite and eternal, then everything that existed must be part of God's nature rather than separate from it. This position, which he called substance monism, made traditional theism logically impossible. The implications of this metaphysical position for understanding human nature were equally revolutionary. If human beings were entirely natural phenomena, then their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors must operate according to natural laws that could be analyzed and understood through rational investigation. This meant that psychology, ethics, and political philosophy could become genuine sciences based on empirical observation and logical analysis, rather than traditional authority or wishful thinking. His approach to ethical questions reflected this naturalistic understanding of human nature. Instead of treating morality as a system of divine commands or arbitrary social conventions, he analyzed ethical behavior as natural phenomena that could be understood through investigation of human psychology and social requirements. Good and evil were not absolute metaphysical categories, but relational terms describing the effects of different actions on human flourishing and social cooperation. This analysis led to what he called the ethics of joy, a systematic account of how rational understanding could enable people to achieve genuine happiness through appropriate management of their emotions and desires. Instead of treating emotions as irrational disturbances that should be suppressed or eliminated, he analyzed them as natural phenomena that could be understood, modified, and directed toward constructive purposes through rational insight into their causes and effects. The centerpiece of this ethical system was what he termed intellectual love, amor intellectualis, a form of emotional satisfaction that emerged from rational understanding of reality as it actually was rather than as one wished it to be. This intellectual love was directed toward what he called God or nature, deus sive natura, but it was love based on understanding rather than faith, acceptance rather than hope, and knowledge rather than belief. His correspondence with other philosophers during this period reveals the excitement and confidence with which he was developing these ideas. Letters to Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society in London, show him engaging with contemporary debates about scientific method, political philosophy, and religious toleration. His exchanges with various Dutch intellectuals demonstrate his growing reputation as an original and powerful thinker whose ideas deserve serious consideration despite their unconventional character. But perhaps most importantly, this period established the pattern that would characterize the rest of his life: complete integration of philosophical theory with practical living. Every aspect of his daily routine reflected his philosophical convictions about rationality, moderation, and emotional equilibrium. He ate simply, dressed modestly, maintained regular schedules, and avoided the social gatherings and political involvements that might have provided distraction from intellectual work, but would also have compromised the philosophical independence that he valued above all external goods. This lifestyle was not ascetic denial of natural pleasures, but rational management of desires and activities according to their contribution to long-term flourishing and intellectual development. He enjoyed friendship, conversation, music, and other forms of recreation, but always within limits that supported rather than undermined his philosophical work. He had achieved what philosophers had theorized about for centuries, but rarely demonstrated: genuine equanimity based on rational understanding rather than ignorance or self-deception. The intellectual productivity of these years was remarkable. In addition to developing the systematic philosophy that would eventually be published as the Ethics, he was writing comprehensive analyses of Cartesian philosophy, preparing materials for what would become the Theological Political Treatise, and conducting extensive correspondence with intellectuals throughout Europe. The young man who had been considered a threat by his religious community was establishing himself as one of the most original and significant philosophers of his generation. Perhaps most significantly, he was demonstrating that intellectual integrity and personal happiness were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. The freedom to think clearly and live authentically had provided satisfactions that more than compensated for the social and material losses that excommunication had required. He was proving through his own example that philosophy could be more than academic exercise. It could be a practical guide to genuine human flourishing, based on rational understanding of reality and oneself. Chapter 5: The Geometric Method. During the late 1650s and early 1660s, Spinoza developed the distinctive philosophical methodology that would distinguish his mature work from all previous systematic philosophy. Inspired by the success of mathematical reasoning in revealing certain truths about spatial and numerical relationships, he began constructing a philosophical system based entirely on geometric demonstration, proceeding from clearly defined axioms and definitions through rigorous logical proofs to necessary conclusions that could not be rationally doubted. This geometric method was more than a stylistic choice. It reflected his fundamental conviction that reality itself was organized according to rational principles that human reason could discover and demonstrate with the same certainty that characterized mathematical knowledge. If geometric reasoning could reveal eternal truths about triangles and circles, then similar reasoning should be able to reveal eternal truths about God, human nature, and moral obligation. The goal was not mere intellectual exercise, but practical wisdom based on genuine knowledge rather than opinion, tradition, or faith. The application of geometric method to metaphysical questions required extraordinary precision in defining fundamental concepts and identifying basic principles that could serve as axioms for subsequent reasoning. Spinoza spent years developing definitions of substance, attribute, mode, causation, and necessity that would support systematic analysis of all existence according to logical principles, rather than anthropomorphic assumptions about divine personality or supernatural intervention. His definition of substance as that which is in itself and is conceived through itself led necessarily to the conclusion that only one substance could exist, since multiple substances would limit each other and therefore fail to meet the criterion of complete self-sufficiency. This single substance possessed infinite attributes, including both thought and extension, which meant that mental and physical phenomena were different aspects of the same underlying reality, rather than separate types of existence that somehow interacted mysteriously. This metaphysical foundation resolved many traditional philosophical problems that had puzzled earlier thinkers. The mind-body problem that had made Cartesian dualism so difficult to defend disappeared when mental and physical events were understood as different descriptions of the same natural processes. The problem of divine intervention in natural causation disappeared when God was understood as the immanent rather than transcendent cause of all natural phenomena. The problem of human free will versus divine determinism was resolved through analysis of freedom as activity in accordance with one's own nature rather than arbitrary choice unconstrained by causal necessity. But the most revolutionary implications of geometric method appeared in Spinoza's analysis of human emotions and ethical behavior. Instead of treating emotions as mysterious psychic forces that disrupted rational thinking, he analyzed them as natural phenomena that operated according to discoverable laws and could be understood through careful observation and logical analysis. Fear, anger, love, hope, and other emotions were not irrational disturbances, but natural responses to perceived benefits and threats that could be modified through rational understanding of their causes and effects. This naturalistic approach to psychology provided the foundation for what he called ethics, demonstrated in geometric order a systematic account of how rational beings could achieve genuine happiness through appropriate management of their emotional responses and social relationships. Instead of prescribing arbitrary rules for moral behavior, this ethics identified the natural conditions that supported human flourishing and demonstrated logically why certain types of behavior were conducive to happiness while others led inevitably to frustration and suffering. The geometric method also provided powerful tools for analyzing religious and political questions that were usually dominated by tradition, authority, and emotional attachment rather than rational analysis. Instead of accepting religious claims because they were traditionally believed or politically useful, this approach subjected all theological propositions to the same logical scrutiny that would be applied to mathematical hypotheses. Instead of defending political arrangements because they were customary or beneficial to particular groups, it analyzed different forms of government according to their effectiveness in promoting genuine human welfare and social cooperation. The development of this methodology required not only intellectual innovation, but personal discipline of an extraordinary kind. Geometric reasoning demanded complete emotional detachment from the conclusions that logical analysis might reach. Traditional beliefs, personal preferences, social expectations, and practical considerations had to be set aside in favor of following arguments wherever they led, regardless of their implications for conventional thinking or comfortable assumptions. This intellectual discipline was reflected in the meticulous care with which Spinoza constructed his arguments and the systematic thoroughness with which he addressed potential objections to his conclusions. Every proposition was supported by rigorous proof. Every definition was carefully formulated to avoid ambiguity, and every inference was checked for logical validity. The resulting philosophical system achieved a level of internal consistency and systematic completeness that few other philosophers have ever approached. But perhaps most remarkably, Spinoza demonstrated that this level of intellectual rigor was compatible with profound serenity and practical wisdom. The geometric method that revealed disturbing truths about human ignorance and cosmic indifference also provided resources for achieving genuine peace of mind based on rational understanding rather than comforting illusions. The same analytical approach that destroyed traditional beliefs about divine providence and human specialness also revealed possibilities for happiness that did not depend on external circumstances or supernatural support. The philosophical system that emerged from this methodological innovation would eventually be recognized as one of the most systematic and powerful achievements in the history of philosophy. But during the period of its development, it served a more immediate function. It provided Spinoza with intellectual tools for understanding and accepting his own situation with remarkable equanimity, and for developing practical wisdom about how to live well under any circumstances that necessity might impose. Chapter 6, The Treatise on Theology in 1670. Spinoza published anonymously what would become one of the most controversial and influential works of political and religious philosophy in European history. The theological political treatise applied his rational analytical methods to questions of biblical interpretation, religious authority, and political organization that were central to the religious and political conflicts of his time. The work's publication created immediate scandal and established him as one of Europe's most radical and dangerous thinkers. The treatise began with systematic analysis of biblical texts using the same historical and literary methods that scholars applied to other ancient documents, instead of assuming that apparent contradictions or scientific inaccuracies in scripture must be explained away through ingenious interpretative strategies. Spinoza treated these features as evidence that biblical texts reflected the knowledge and perspectives available to their original authors, rather than supernatural revelation of eternal truths. This approach led to conclusions that challenged fundamental assumptions of both Jewish and Christian theology. The Hebrew Scriptures, according to his analysis, were historical documents that recorded the beliefs and experiences of ancient peoples who understood natural phenomena through anthropomorphic categories and supernatural explanations that reflected pre-scientific cosmology. The prophetic books recorded psychological experiences of individuals who interpreted their insights according to the conceptual frameworks available in their cultural contexts. The implications for religious authority were revolutionary. If biblical texts were human documents rather than divine revelations, then religious institutions that based their authority on scriptural interpretation were making claims that could not be rationally sustained. If religious teachings were culturally conditioned expressions of human understanding rather than eternal truths, then they should be evaluated according to their practical effects on human welfare, rather than accepted simply because they were traditionally believed. This analysis extended to questions of political authority and religious toleration that were central to European conflicts between Protestant and Catholic powers, and between religious and secular approaches to social organization. Spinoza argued that the primary function of government was to maintain peace and security that made individual freedom possible, not to enforce religious orthodoxy or promote particular theological beliefs. Religious belief and practice should be matters of individual conscience rather than state policy. The treatise's discussion of religious toleration was particularly revolutionary because it was based not on skeptical indifference to religious questions, but on rational analysis of the relationship between religious belief and social welfare. Spinoza argued that enforced religious conformity was both practically ineffective and ethically unjustifiable because genuine religious conviction could not be produced through external pressure, and because diversity of belief posed no threat to social order when combined with common commitment to justice and mutual cooperation. His analysis of different forms of government reflected similar commitment to rational evaluation according to practical effectiveness rather than traditional authority or theoretical elegance. The best government was that which most effectively promoted the conditions necessary for human flourishing: security, freedom, education, and economic opportunity. Different political arrangements might be appropriate for different historical circumstances, but all legitimate government had to serve human welfare rather than the interests of particular classes or religious groups. The treatise also included sophisticated analysis of the relationship between philosophy and religion that attempted to resolve conflicts between rational inquiry and religious faith. Spinoza argued that philosophy and religion serve different human needs, and therefore should not be considered competing approaches to the same questions. Philosophy was concerned with understanding reality through rational analysis. Religion was concerned with promoting moral behavior through emotional persuasion and social solidarity. This distinction suggested that conflicts between science and religion were based on conceptual confusions about their respective domains. Religious texts should not be treated as scientific authorities, and scientific discoveries should not be considered threats to legitimate religious concerns. Both philosophy and religion could contribute to human welfare when they were properly understood and appropriately applied to their distinctive functions. But perhaps the most radical aspect of the treatise was its demonstration that systematic rational analysis could be applied to religious and political questions that had traditionally been considered beyond the scope of human reason. Instead of accepting religious and political authority as divinely established or naturally inevitable, Spinoza subjected all claims to authority to the same logical scrutiny that would be applied to any other propositions about reality. The public reaction to the treatise confirmed his analysis of how religious and political authorities responded to rational challenges to their power. The work was immediately banned by both Protestant and Catholic authorities, condemned by Jewish communities throughout Europe, and attacked by philosophers who were themselves critical of religious orthodoxy, but considered Spinoza's position dangerously radical. These reactions revealed the accuracy of his insight that most people preferred comforting illusions to disturbing truths, and that institutions based on traditional authority would always resist rational inquiry that threatened their foundations. But the continued circulation of the treatise, despite official prohibition, also demonstrated the appeal of systematic rational analysis to readers who were dissatisfied with conventional answers to fundamental questions about religion, politics, and human nature. The anonymous publication of such controversial material also reflected Spinoza's practical wisdom about the relationship between intellectual honesty and social consequences. He was committed to developing and sharing insights that he believed could contribute to human welfare, but he was also realistic about the personal costs that might result from complete intellectual transparency in contexts dominated by irrationality and prejudice. The treatise thus established him as a major figure in European intellectual life, while also confirming his reputation as a dangerous radical whose ideas threatened the foundations of religious and political authority. This reputation would affect all his subsequent work and social relationships, but it also created opportunities for influence that would not have been available to someone who remained safely within conventional boundaries. Chapter 7, Ethics Demonstrated. During the final decade of his life, Spinoza completed the work that would secure his position as one of history's greatest systematic philosophers. The Ethics Demonstrated in Geometric Order, a comprehensive philosophical system that applied mathematical reasoning to questions of metaphysics, psychology, and moral philosophy with unprecedented rigor and systematic thoroughness. The work represented the culmination of everything he had learned about rational analysis and its application to fundamental problems of human existence. The Ethics was organized according to the geometric method he had developed during the previous decade, proceeding from carefully formulated definitions and axioms through logical demonstrations to necessary conclusions about the nature of reality, human psychology, and the conditions for genuine happiness. The work's 5 parts addressed, in sequence, God or nature, the human mind, the emotions, human bondage to inadequate ideas and destructive passions, and finally human freedom achieved through rational understanding. The metaphysical foundation established in part, I resolved many traditional philosophical problems through systematic analysis of substance, causation, and necessity, by demonstrating that only one infinite substance could exist, and that this substance possessed both mental and physical attributes. Spinoza eliminated the mind-body dualism that had made previous philosophical systems so difficult to maintain consistently. Mental and physical phenomena were different aspects of the same natural processes, rather than separate types of existence that interacted mysteriously. This metaphysical position also eliminated the traditional problem of reconciling divine omnipotence with natural causation, since God was identical with nature rather than separate from it. Natural laws were expressions of divine necessity rather than constraints on divine freedom. Everything that occurred was both naturally determined and divinely ordained. But this did not make natural events any less real or human understanding any less valuable. Part I's analysis of human psychology extended this naturalistic approach to questions about consciousness, knowledge, and personal identity that had puzzled philosophers since ancient times. The human mind was not a supernatural soul temporarily imprisoned in a material body, but the mental aspect of the complex physical processes that constituted human biological functioning. Mental events were as natural as any other phenomena, and could be analyzed through the same rational methods that applied to physical events. This analysis provided sophisticated account of different types of knowledge and their relationships to human welfare and ethical development. Sensory experience provided useful but limited information about immediate practical concerns. Rational analysis revealed general principles and causal relationships that enabled more effective action and better understanding of natural processes. But the highest form of knowledge was what he called intuitive knowledge, immediate rational insight into the essential nature of particular things and their relationships to the eternal principles that governed all existence. Part II's treatment of emotions as natural phenomena subject to rational analysis represented one of the most original and practically valuable aspects of the entire system. instead of treating emotions as irrational disturbances that disrupted clear thinking. Spinoza analyzed them as natural responses to perceived benefits and threats that operated according to discoverable psychological laws and could be modified through appropriate understanding of their causes and effects. This analysis identified the fundamental emotional dynamics that shaped human behavior, the striving conatus that characterize all living things, the joy that accompanied increased vitality and power, the sadness that resulted from diminished capacity and external constraint, and the various combinations of these basic affects that produce the complex emotional life of rational beings. Understanding these dynamics provided tools for emotional self-regulation that could dramatically improve both individual welfare and social relationships. Part 4 examined the psychological mechanisms that kept most people trapped in patterns of thought and behavior that led to frustration, conflict, and unnecessary suffering. Human bondage resulted not from external oppression, but from inadequate understanding of one's own nature and situation. People who were guided by confused ideas about their own interests inevitably acted in ways that undermined their genuine welfare and created conflicts with others who were equally confused about the conditions for human flourishing. The analysis of human bondage also revealed how social and political institutions could either support or obstruct the development of rational understanding and emotional maturity. Educational systems that promoted critical thinking, economic arrangements that provided security without luxury, and political structures that protected individual freedom while maintaining social cooperation all contributed to creating conditions that supported human development rather than perpetuating ignorance and conflict. Part V presented Spinoza's account of human liberation through rational understanding, what he considered the highest achievement possible for finite beings embedded in infinite reality. Freedom was not the ability to make arbitrary choices unconstrained by natural necessity, but the capacity to act according to one's own rational nature rather than being passively determined by external forces and internal compulsions. This freedom was achieved through the development of what he called intellectual love of God or nature, amor intellectualis Dei, a form of emotional satisfaction that emerged from rational understanding of reality as it actually was rather than as one wished it to be. This intellectual love was simultaneously cognitive achievement and emotional fulfillment, providing both clear understanding and profound satisfaction that did not depend on external circumstances or supernatural support. The Ethics concluded with analysis of how this intellectual love related to traditional concerns about personal immortality and ultimate meaning. While individual personality and memory could not survive bodily death, the rational insights and emotional achievements that constituted genuine human development were eternal aspects of infinite understanding that participated in the timeless reality of truth itself. The completed work represented not only systematic philosophical achievement, but practical demonstration that rational analysis could provide resources for living well under any circumstances that necessity might impose. Every proposition had been tested against Spinoza's own experience of excommunication, social isolation, and economic uncertainty, and the system had proved capable of supporting genuine equanimity based on understanding rather than illusion. Chapter 8. The Life of Reason, the daily routine that Spinoza established during his years of philosophical independence, reflected his conviction that authentic human happiness required practical application of rational principles to all aspects of existence, from the most mundane details of physical maintenance to the highest forms of intellectual and emotional development. His lifestyle demonstrated that philosophical wisdom was not mere academic exercise, but practical guidance for achieving genuine satisfaction and inner peace. He rose early each morning, beginning the day with mathematical studies that provided mental discipline and emotional equilibrium for the intellectual work that followed. Mathematics served both as intellectual recreation and spiritual exercise, offering experiences of certain knowledge and logical necessity that reinforced his confidence in reason's capacity to discover truth about more complex philosophical questions. The daily encounter with geometric proof reminded him that reality was rationally structured and therefore comprehensible to patient analytical investigation. His breakfast was simple but adequate, reflecting his understanding that bodily health required appropriate nutrition without luxurious excess that might distract attention from intellectual pursuits or create unnecessary dependencies on expensive pleasures. He had concluded that genuine satisfaction came from the harmony between one's activities and one's essential nature, rather than from the accumulation of external goods that could always be lost or stolen. The morning hours were dedicated to his most demanding philosophical work, the systematic development of the ethics and preparation of materials for other major projects. This intellectual labor was not drudgery, but the activity he found most naturally satisfying, the expression of his deepest capacities and commitments. Writing philosophy was simultaneously personal fulfillment and contribution to human understanding, individual achievement, and service to others who might benefit from clearer thinking about fundamental questions. His approach to friendship reflected similar integration of rational principles with emotional satisfaction. He maintained regular correspondence with intellectuals throughout Europe, engaging in philosophical discussions that provided both intellectual stimulation and social connection. These relationships were based on mutual respect for rational inquiry rather than conventional social bonds, creating forms of intimacy that supported individual development while providing genuine companionship. Local friendships with neighbors and fellow intellectuals in The Hague, where he had settled during his final years, provided opportunities for conversation, music, and other forms of recreation that enriched his life without compromising his philosophical independence. He enjoyed the company of people who appreciated his ideas, but did not require him to moderate his convictions or accept conventional beliefs for the sake of social harmony. His economic arrangements demonstrated practical application of his insights about the relationship between material circumstances and psychological welfare. The income from lens grinding and private tutoring provided sufficient resources for a comfortable but modest lifestyle that protected him from both the anxiety of poverty and the corruption of wealth. Financial independence supported intellectual freedom, while freedom from material excess prevented the psychological complications that accompanied luxury. He had refused several opportunities for more lucrative or prestigious employment, including academic appointments that would have provided greater financial security but might have required compromises in his philosophical work or public expression of his ideas. The University of Heidelberg had offered him a philosophy chair with assurance that he would have considerable freedom in his teaching, but he declined because any institutional affiliation would necessarily involve some constraints on his intellectual independence. His daily routine also included regular physical exercise, recreational reading, and social activities that maintained his health and provided psychological balance. He understood that philosophical work required a sound physical foundation, and that rational thinking could be distorted by neglect of bodily needs or excessive intellectual intensity. The integration of physical and mental activities reflected his metaphysical conviction that mind and body were aspects of the same natural reality, rather than separate substances in potential conflict. Perhaps most remarkably, his approach to potential romantic relationships demonstrated his ability to apply rational principles to emotional situations that typically overwhelmed clear thinking. He had experienced romantic attraction and had considered marriage during his earlier years, but he concluded that conventional domestic arrangements would not be compatible with the kind of life he was committed to living. This decision reflected not misanthropic rejection of human intimacy, but realistic assessment of what forms of relationship could support rather than compromise his essential nature. His evenings were often spent in conversation with friends who shared his intellectual interests, discussing philosophical questions or contemporary political developments with the kind of analytical rigor he brought to his formal philosophical work. These discussions provided opportunities to test his ideas against other perspectives and to develop his insights through the process of defending and clarifying his positions. The lifestyle he had created represented practical demonstration that genuine human autonomy was possible for those willing to accept the costs and disciplines that such autonomy required. He had achieved what philosophers had theorized about for centuries: complete integration of intellectual conviction with practical living, systematic philosophy with daily routine, rational understanding with emotional satisfaction. This integration was tested repeatedly by external circumstances that might have disturbed someone less committed to philosophical principles. Political persecution, social ostracism, economic uncertainty, and physical illness all affected his life at various times, but none succeeded in destroying the fundamental equanimity that resulted from his rational approach to existence. He had discovered resources for happiness that were immune to the external circumstances that made most people miserable because they were based on understanding and accepting reality rather than demanding that reality conform to human wishes. Chapter 9. Political wisdom. Spinoza's analysis of political questions reflected the same rational methodology and naturalistic assumptions that characterized his metaphysical and ethical philosophy, but applied to problems of social organization, governmental authority, and collective human welfare. His political philosophy represented one of the most systematic and radical attempts to understand political phenomena as natural processes subject to scientific analysis rather than mysterious expressions of divine will or arbitrary human convention. The foundation of his political thinking was the recognition that human beings were naturally social creatures whose individual welfare was necessarily connected to the welfare of the communities within which they lived. Unlike contract theorists who imagined isolated individuals choosing to create society for mutual benefit, Spinoza understood sociality as an essential aspect of human nature that made individual development and happiness possible only within appropriate social contexts. This naturalistic understanding of human sociality led to analysis of political authority as a practical necessity for coordinating individual interests and resolving conflicts that inevitably arose when many people lived together in limited spaces with limited resources. Government was not divinely ordained or naturally hierarchical, but was a human creation designed to serve human needs for security, cooperation, and mutual aid. The best government was, therefore, that which most effectively promoted the conditions necessary for individual flourishing and social cooperation: security from violence, protection of property rights, enforcement of contracts, provision of education, and maintenance of institutions that supported economic development and cultural advancement. Different political arrangements might be appropriate for different historical circumstances, but all legitimate government had to serve human welfare rather than the interests of particular classes, religious groups, or political factions. His analysis of democracy as potentially the most rational form of government was based not on abstract theories about human equality, but on practical considerations about which political arrangements were most likely to promote genuine human welfare over time. Democratic institutions provided mechanisms for peaceful resolution of conflicts, protection of minority interests, and adaptation to changing circumstances that made them more stable and effective than alternatives based on hereditary privilege or religious authority. But Spinoza's support for democratic government was qualified by realistic assessment of the psychological and educational conditions that made democratic participation constructive rather than destructive. Democracy could function well only among citizens who possessed sufficient rational understanding to evaluate policies according to their long-term consequences rather than their immediate emotional appeal. Without appropriate education and cultural development, democratic institutions could become means for implementing popular prejudices rather than promoting genuine collective welfare. This analysis led to sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility that avoided both anarchistic rejection of all authority and authoritarian subordination of individual welfare to collective power. Individual freedom was valuable because it supported human development and creativity, but it could be sustained only within social contexts that provided security, education, and economic opportunity. Social cooperation was necessary for individual flourishing, but it could be maintained only through institutions that respected and promoted individual autonomy. His approach to religious toleration reflected similar integration of principled commitment to freedom with practical understanding of social requirements. Religious belief and practice should be matters of individual conscience rather than state policy, because enforced religious conformity was both practically ineffective and ethically unjustifiable. But religious freedom had to be combined with common commitment to justice and mutual cooperation if religiously diverse societies were to function peacefully and effectively. The political analysis also addressed questions about the relationship between economic arrangements and political stability that would become central to later political philosophy. Extreme inequality of wealth created conditions that made democratic government difficult to maintain because it gave some citizens power to dominate others through economic pressure rather than rational persuasion. But economic equality imposed through governmental redistribution could destroy the incentives for productive activity that made prosperity possible. The solution lay in economic arrangements that provided security and opportunity for all citizens while maintaining incentives for individual effort and innovation. This required combination of market mechanisms that rewarded productive activity with social institutions that prevented extreme inequality and provided support for those who could not support themselves through market participation. Spinoza's political correspondence during the final decades of his life reveals his growing concern about the political instability and religious conflict that were affecting the Dutch Republic and other European societies. His analysis suggested that much political conflict resulted from inadequate understanding of the natural foundations of social cooperation and from attempts to organize societies according to theological or ideological principles rather than rational assessment of human needs and possibilities. The practical implications of his political philosophy extended beyond formal governmental institutions to questions about education, economic policy, and cultural development that affected the quality of social life. The most important political work was often educational, helping citizens develop the rational understanding and emotional maturity necessary for effective participation in democratic institutions and peaceful resolution of inevitable social conflicts. His final political writings emphasized the importance of intellectual freedom for social development and political stability. Societies that suppressed rational inquiry and free expression of ideas deprived themselves of the intellectual resources necessary for addressing complex social problems and adapting to changing circumstances. Political persecution of intellectuals was not only unjust, but practically counterproductive, because it prevented societies from benefiting from their best minds. This analysis provided philosophical foundation for what would later be recognized as liberal democratic political theory, but it was distinctive in being based entirely on naturalistic understanding of human psychology and social requirements, rather than abstract theories about natural rights or divine commands. Political freedom was valuable because it supported human flourishing, and political institutions were legitimate to the extent that they effectively promoted such flourishing for all members of society. Chapter 10. The Circle of Friends. Despite his excommunication and social isolation from the Amsterdam Jewish community, Spinoza gradually developed a network of intellectual friendships that provided both emotional support and stimulating exchange of ideas with some of Europe's most advanced thinkers. These relationships demonstrated that authentic human connection could be based on shared commitment to rational inquiry rather than conventional social bonds, and that philosophical life need not require complete solitude or misanthropic rejection of human intimacy. His correspondence with Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society in London, provided regular contact with developments in experimental science and natural philosophy that were transforming European intellectual life. Oldenburg served as an informal conduit between leading scientists and philosophers throughout Europe, and his relationship with Spinoza helped establish the Dutch philosopher's reputation among intellectuals who might otherwise have known him only through hostile reports about his religious and political views. These letters reveal Spinoza engaging seriously with contemporary scientific questions while maintaining his distinctive philosophical perspective on the relationship between scientific discoveries and broader questions about the nature of reality and human knowledge. He appreciated the achievements of experimental science, but insisted that scientific discoveries needed to be integrated within comprehensive philosophical frameworks that could address questions about meaning and value that were beyond the scope of purely empirical investigation. His friendship with Johann Baumeister, a physician and amateur philosopher in Amsterdam, provided opportunities for extended philosophical discussions about metaphysical and ethical questions that were central to Spinoza's developing system. Baumeister was one of the few people who understood the full scope and systematic character of Spinoza's philosophical project, and their conversations helped Spinoza refine his ideas and clarify his arguments through the process of defending them against intelligent criticism. The relationship with Lodewijk Meyer, a physician and playwright who shared Spinoza's interest in applying rational methods to religious and political questions, created opportunities for collaboration on projects that neither could have completed independently. Meyer's literary skills and social connections complemented Spinoza's philosophical rigor and systematic approach, resulting in several jointly authored works that advanced their shared intellectual agenda. Perhaps most significant was his relationship with Georg Hermann Schuler, a young German intellectual who became one of Spinoza's most devoted disciples and eventually organized the posthumous publication of his complete works. Schuller's enthusiasm and dedication provided practical support that was essential for preserving and transmitting Spinoza's philosophical legacy, while his intelligent questions and criticisms helped Spinoza develop his ideas with greater precision and systematic thoroughness. The informal philosophical circle that developed around Spinoza during his final years in The Hague included several other intellectuals who shared his commitment to rational inquiry and his rejection of traditional religious and political authority. These relationships provided the kind of intellectual community that made sustained philosophical work possible while offering genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than conventional social expectations. These friendships were maintained primarily through extensive correspondence that reveals Spinoza's remarkable capacity for combining rigorous philosophical analysis with genuine personal warmth and concern for his friends' welfare. His letters addressed both abstract theoretical questions and practical problems that his correspondents faced in their personal and professional lives, demonstrating his conviction that philosophical understanding should contribute to practical wisdom about how to live well. The philosophical discussions that occurred within this circle addressed many of the most difficult questions that would occupy later philosophers: the relationship between deterministic causation and moral responsibility, the possibility of objective knowledge about ethical values, the proper relationship between scientific understanding and religious belief, and the political conditions necessary for intellectual freedom and cultural development. But perhaps most importantly, these relationships provided Spinoza with empirical confirmation of his theoretical insights about the possibility of human community based on rational understanding and mutual aid rather than shared prejudices or external authority. The friendships he maintained demonstrated that people with very different backgrounds, temperaments, and practical interests could achieve genuine intimacy through common commitment to truth and mutual support for individual development. His approach to friendship reflected his broader philosophical understanding of emotions as natural phenomena that could be cultivated and directed through rational insight into their causes and effects. Instead of treating friendship as mysterious emotional attraction or conventional social obligation, he understood it as natural consequence of mutual recognition between rational beings who appreciated each other's contributions to understanding and human welfare. The loyalty and affection that his friends maintained for him throughout the social ostracism and political persecution that affected his reputation demonstrated that authentic human relationships could survive external pressures that might destroy connections based on convenience or conventional respectability. These friendships were sustained by intellectual and emotional bonds that were stronger than the social forces that made association with him potentially dangerous. The circle of friends that surrounded Spinoza during his mature years also served important practical functions in preserving and transmitting his philosophical work. Several of his correspondents maintained copies of his manuscripts, helped prepare materials for publication, and worked to ensure that his ideas would be available to future readers who might benefit from his insights about reason, emotion, and the possibilities for human happiness. The intellectual community that developed around his philosophical work provided a model for how rational inquiry could create genuine human solidarity that transcended the conventional divisions of religion, nationality, and social class. These relationships demonstrated that philosophy was not merely individual pursuit of abstract truth, but collaborative activity that required mutual support and shared commitment to understanding reality as it actually was rather than as various forms of authority claimed it should be. Chapter 11: Illness and Serenity. The final years of Spinoza's life were marked by increasing physical frailty that provided a severe test of his philosophical convictions about the relationship between rational understanding and emotional equanimity. His lungs, weakened by years of inhaling glass particles from his lens-grinding work, began to fail gradually but inexorably, creating conditions of chronic illness that might have overwhelmed someone with different philosophical resources for understanding and accepting necessity. His response to declining health demonstrated remarkable consistency between his theoretical analysis of emotions and his practical approach to circumstances beyond his control. Instead of raging against his physical limitations or seeking desperate remedies that might provide false hope, he accepted his condition with the same rational equanimity that he had applied to social ostracism and economic uncertainty. Illness was simply another natural phenomenon that could be understood, managed appropriately, but not ultimately overcome through human effort. This acceptance was not passive resignation, but active adaptation of his activities and expectations to the realities of his changing physical circumstances. He continued his philosophical work, but adjusted his schedule and methods to accommodate reduced energy and frequent periods of respiratory distress. He maintained his correspondence with friends, but acknowledged honestly when illness prevented him from engaging with complex philosophical questions that required sustained concentration. His letters during this period reveal continuing intellectual vitality and emotional stability despite increasingly severe physical symptoms. He discussed philosophical questions with the same analytical rigor that had characterized his earlier work, while also addressing practical matters related to the preservation of his manuscripts and the posthumous publication of works that he would not live to see completed. Perhaps most remarkably, his approach to the possibility of death reflected his philosophical understanding of human mortality as a natural feature of finite existence rather than a tragic accident that required supernatural consolation or heroic denial. Death was simply the natural conclusion of biological processes that had made consciousness possible for a limited period. The rational understanding and emotional achievements that constituted genuine human development were eternal aspects of infinite reality that participated in timeless truth, regardless of the survival or destruction of particular individual personalities. This perspective enabled him to continue working productively during periods when most people would have been paralyzed by anxiety about their mortality or desperate attempts to postpone the inevitable. He completed several important philosophical projects, maintained active correspondence with friends throughout Europe, and continued to provide guidance to younger intellectuals who sought his advice about philosophical and practical questions. His daily routine during the final years demonstrated practical application of his insights about the proper relationship between rational activity and physical circumstances. He worked when his energy permitted intensive intellectual effort, rested when respiratory problems made sustained concentration impossible, and maintained social relationships through whatever forms of communication his health allowed. Every aspect of his schedule reflected acceptance of natural limitations combined with determination to make the best possible use of whatever capacities remained available. The philosophical equanimity that he maintained during this difficult period was not based on denial of his situation or false optimism about recovery, but on genuine integration of rational understanding with emotional acceptance. He had developed through years of philosophical work and practical application the psychological resources necessary for maintaining inner peace under any external circumstances that necessity might impose. His friends' accounts of visiting him during his final illness describe someone whose physical weakness was accompanied by remarkable mental clarity and emotional serenity. He continued to engage in philosophical discussions with enthusiasm and insight, while acknowledging honestly the limitations that illness imposed on his activities and future plans. There was no pretense that philosophical understanding could overcome natural necessity, but also no suggestion that natural necessity made philosophical understanding meaningless. The integration of theoretical conviction with practical wisdom that characterized his approach to illness provided a final demonstration of his philosophical system's capacity to support genuine human flourishing under any circumstances. The rational analysis of emotions that he had developed through years of systematic study proved capable of providing practical guidance for accepting what could not be changed while continuing to value and pursue what remained possible. His correspondence during the final months reveals plans for preserving his philosophical legacy through friends who had committed themselves to preparing his works for posthumous publication. These arrangements reflected his understanding that individual mortality was compatible with participation in eternal truth through the rational insights and cultural contributions that could outlast particular personalities and continue to benefit future generations. The calm dignity with which he faced his approaching death provided final validation of his conviction that philosophical wisdom was not mere academic exercise, but practical guidance for living well under any conditions that finite existence might require. He had achieved what philosophers had theorized about for centuries: genuine peace of mind based on rational understanding rather than comforting illusions, complete emotional freedom achieved through acceptance of natural necessity. The man who died quietly in The Hague on February 21, 1677, at the age of 44, had demonstrated through his own example that extraordinary serenity was possible for anyone willing to undertake the intellectual and emotional work necessary for understanding reality as it actually was, rather than as human wishes suggested it should be. Chapter 12. Posthumous Revolution. The publication of Spinoza's complete works in 1677, just months after his death, initiated an intellectual revolution that would transform European philosophy, religious thought, and scientific understanding over the following centuries. The systematic presentation of his geometric method applied to metaphysical and ethical questions provided readers with analytical tools for understanding reality that were more rigorous and comprehensive than anything previously available in philosophical literature. The immediate reaction was largely hostile, as religious and political authorities throughout Europe recognized that Spinoza's philosophical system posed fundamental challenges to traditional assumptions about divine authority, human nature, and social organization. His works were banned by Catholic and Protestant churches, condemned by Jewish communities, and attacked by philosophers who considered his conclusions dangerous to social stability and individual morality. But alongside this official condemnation, the works began attracting serious attention from intellectuals who recognized the power and consistency of his analytical approach, even when they disagreed with his conclusions. The geometric method's demonstration that complex philosophical questions could be addressed through systematic rational analysis provided a model that influenced subsequent developments in philosophy, science, and political theory. The metaphysical system developed in the Ethics offered solutions to theoretical problems that had puzzled philosophers since ancient times. The mind-body problem that had made Cartesian dualism so difficult to defend was resolved through analysis of mental and physical phenomena as different aspects of the same natural processes. The problem of reconciling divine omnipotence with natural causation was dissolved through identification of God with nature, rather than treating them as separate realities that might conflict. But perhaps most significant was the systematic analysis of emotions as natural phenomena subject to rational understanding and appropriate management. This psychological theory provided practical tools for emotional self-regulation that proved useful to readers seeking guidance about how to achieve greater equanimity and more satisfying relationships, regardless of their philosophical commitments about metaphysical questions. The political philosophy that emerged from his naturalistic understanding of human sociality influenced the development of liberal democratic theory through its analysis of governmental authority as practical necessity for promoting human welfare rather than divine mandate or natural hierarchy. The argument for religious toleration based on rational assessment of social requirements rather than skeptical indifference to religious questions provided intellectual foundation for policies that would eventually become standard in constitutional democracies. The biblical criticism developed in the theological political treatise established methodological principles for historical study of religious texts that would transform academic theology and contribute to the development of scientific approaches to understanding cultural and religious phenomena. The treatment of sacred texts as historical documents subject to literary and historical analysis rather than supernatural revelation opened possibilities for scholarly investigation that had been largely foreclosed by traditional religious assumptions. Perhaps most importantly, the complete philosophical system demonstrated that systematic rational analysis could be applied to any questions about reality, human nature, or social organization, without exempting any beliefs from logical scrutiny simply because they were traditionally accepted or socially useful. This methodological commitment to following rational arguments wherever they led, regardless of their implications for conventional thinking, provided inspiration for subsequent generations of thinkers who sought intellectual honesty about fundamental questions. The influence spread gradually through informal networks of intellectuals who shared manuscript copies and discussed Spinoza's ideas in private correspondence and secret societies. The German Enlightenment, particularly the work of Gotthold Lessing and later Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, drew extensively on Spinozan themes and analytical approaches. French materialists like Paul-Henri Thiry and Denis Diderot found in his naturalistic metaphysics philosophical foundation for scientific approaches to understanding human psychology and social organization. The Romantic movement's emphasis on the unity of nature and consciousness, feeling and reason, individual development, and cosmic reality reflected Spinozan insights even among thinkers who rejected his systematic rationalism in favor of more intuitive approaches to fundamental questions. Friedrich Schelling and Teufel. Hegel acknowledged their debt to Spinoza's metaphysical innovations while developing their own systematic approaches to understanding the relationship between mind and reality. The 19th century witnessed growing recognition of Spinoza's significance for understanding the relationship between scientific knowledge and human values, individual psychology, and social organization, rational analysis, and emotional satisfaction. Thinkers as diverse as George Eliot, who translated his works into English, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who considered him one of philosophy's greatest figures, found in his systematic naturalism resources for addressing questions that traditional religious and philosophical approaches had left unresolved. The emergence of scientific psychology during the late 19th and early 20th centuries confirmed many of his insights about emotions as natural phenomena subject to rational analysis and appropriate modification through understanding their causes and effects. Cognitive behavioral therapy and other contemporary therapeutic approaches reflect psychological principles that he had developed through philosophical analysis centuries before empirical psychology provided experimental confirmation of their validity. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science have provided biological foundation for his insight that mental and physical phenomena are different aspects of the same natural processes, rather than separate types of existence that interact mysteriously. The identification of consciousness with particular patterns of neural activity reflects the same naturalistic understanding that led him to reject mind-body dualism in favor of systematic materialism. The continuing relevance of his political philosophy is evident in contemporary discussions about religious toleration, democratic institutions, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility. His analysis of how rational societies should address religious and cultural diversity while maintaining common commitment to justice and mutual cooperation remains applicable to challenges facing pluralistic democracies throughout the world. In the 21st century, Spinoza's philosophical insights have found unexpected relevance in fields ranging from neuroscience and psychology to environmental ethics and quantum physics, as researchers and theorists discover that his systematic naturalism provides conceptual frameworks for understanding phenomena that earlier philosophical approaches had difficulty addressing. The integration of scientific knowledge with philosophical wisdom that characterizes his work has proved particularly valuable for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and broader perspective on human values and social organization. Contemporary neuroscience has provided biological validation for his insight that mental and physical phenomena are different aspects of the same underlying reality, rather than separate substances that interact mysteriously. The identification of consciousness with particular patterns of neural activity, the demonstration that emotions involve specific biochemical processes, and the discovery that psychological interventions can produce measurable changes in brain structure all confirm his naturalistic understanding of the mind-body relationship. Recent research in cognitive psychology and affective neuroscience has vindicated his analysis of emotions as natural phenomena that can be understood, predicted, and modified through appropriate interventions based on knowledge of their causes and effects. Cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness meditation, and other evidence-based approaches to emotional regulation reflect psychological principles that he developed through philosophical analysis centuries before empirical research provided experimental confirmation of their effectiveness. The emergence of positive psychology as a scientific discipline concerned with understanding the conditions that support human flourishing rather than merely treating psychological dysfunction has rediscovered many of his insights about the relationship between rational understanding, emotional satisfaction, and genuine well-being. His conception of happiness as involving active engagement with reality rather than passive satisfaction of desires anticipates contemporary research on intrinsic motivation, flow states, and eudaimonic well-being. Environmental philosophy has found in his identification of God with nature a conceptual foundation for developing ethical relationships with the natural world that avoid both anthropocentric exploitation and romantic sentimentalization. His understanding of human beings as natural phenomena embedded within larger natural systems provides philosophical basis for environmental policies that recognize human dependence on ecological health, while acknowledging human responsibility for environmental stewardship. The development of complexity theory and system science has confirmed his insight that natural phenomena at all levels of organization exhibit emergent properties that result from the interactions among simpler components according to natural laws that can be understood through rational analysis. His systematic approach to understanding how complex realities emerge from simpler principles has influenced contemporary research in fields ranging from biology and ecology to economics and social organization. Quantum physics has raised questions about the nature of causation, measurement, and the relationship between observer and observed that echo themes in Spinoza's analysis of the relationship between knowledge and reality. While the specific phenomena that quantum mechanics addresses were unknown in his time, his systematic analysis of how human understanding relates to the reality it seeks to comprehend provides conceptual resources for interpreting the philosophical implications of quantum discoveries. Contemporary political philosophy has rediscovered the relevance of his naturalistic approach to questions about democracy, liberty, and social justice that treats political institutions as human creations designed to serve human needs rather than expressions of divine will or natural hierarchy. His analysis of how rational societies should balance individual freedom with social cooperation while protecting minority rights and promoting collective welfare remains applicable to challenges facing contemporary democratic institutions. The globalization of communication and economic activity has created conditions that require the kind of cosmopolitan perspective that emerges naturally from his philosophical system. His understanding of human beings as rational creatures capable of cooperation across conventional boundaries of religion, nationality, and cultural tradition provides conceptual foundation for addressing global challenges that require unprecedented levels of international coordination and mutual understanding. Developments in artificial intelligence and cognitive science have raised questions about the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and moral agency that require the kind of systematic analysis that Spinoza applied to traditional philosophical problems. His naturalistic understanding of mental phenomena as natural processes, rather than supernatural mysteries, provides analytical tools for understanding how artificial systems might exhibit characteristics traditionally associated with conscious experience. The continuing relevance of his insights about the relationship between rational understanding and emotional satisfaction has made his works increasingly popular among readers seeking practical wisdom about how to live well in contemporary societies characterized by rapid technological change, cultural diversity, and economic uncertainty. His demonstration that philosophical understanding can provide practical guidance for achieving equanimity and satisfaction under any circumstances continues to attract people seeking alternatives to both religious consolation and nihilistic despair. Perhaps most significantly, his systematic integration of scientific knowledge with philosophical wisdom provides a model for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and broader perspective on human values and social organization. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other technological developments raise questions that cannot be addressed adequately through purely scientific or purely humanistic approaches, but require the kind of comprehensive understanding that emerges from systematic analysis of the relationship between human needs and natural possibilities. The philosophical system that emerged from a 17th century lens, Grinder's workshop has proved to contain conceptual resources for understanding contemporary realities that its author could never have imagined. This continuing relevance suggests that his commitment to rational analysis of fundamental questions about reality, human nature, and social organization identified principles and methods that transcend particular historical circumstances and remain valuable for anyone seeking clear understanding of their situation and possibilities. The culminating insight of Spinoza's philosophical system was his discovery that genuine human happiness could be achieved through what he called active emotions that emerged from rational understanding rather than passive responses to external circumstances beyond individual control. This ethics of joy presented a revolutionary approach to moral philosophy that treated psychological well-being as both the goal and the foundation of ethical behavior, rather than something that needed to be sacrificed for the sake of moral duty or social conformity. The foundation of this ethical system was his analysis of human beings as naturally striving creatures whose fundamental tendency was toward increased vitality, enhanced capacity, and expanded power of action. This driving conatus was not selfish ego assertion, but the basic life force that characterized all natural phenomena and expressed itself in rational beings through desires for understanding, creative activity, and meaningful relationships with others who shared similar aspirations. Joy, according to his analysis, was the emotion that accompanied increases in this vital power, while sadness resulted from circumstances that diminished individual capacity and constrained natural development. But unlike simplistic hedonism that sought immediate pleasure regardless of long-term consequences, his ethics of joy focused on activities and relationships that supported sustainable expansion of human capabilities, rather than temporary satisfactions that might undermine genuine flourishing. This approach led to systematic analysis of different types of joy and their relationships to lasting happiness and social harmony. Pleasures that depended on external circumstances or other people's suffering were inherently unstable and ultimately self-defeating because they created psychological dependencies that made happiness vulnerable to forces beyond individual control. But joys that emerged from the exercise of one's own rational and creative capacities were immune to external interference and became stronger through repeated practice. The highest form of joy was what he called intellectual love. Amor intellectualis, the emotional satisfaction that accompanied rational understanding of reality as it actually was rather than as human desires suggested it should be. This intellectual love was simultaneously cognitive achievement and emotional fulfillment, providing both clear knowledge and profound satisfaction that increased through sharing with others rather than diminishing through competition for scarce resources. This intellectual love was directed toward what he called God or nature, deus sive natura, but it was love based on understanding rather than faith, acceptance rather than hope, and appreciation of reality's actual structure rather than wishful thinking about supernatural intervention or cosmic purpose designed specifically for human benefit. The love was intellectual because it emerged from rational insight, but it was genuine love because it involved complete emotional commitment to the object of understanding. The practical implications of this ethics were revolutionary for traditional approaches to moral philosophy. Instead of treating ethics as a system of rules that constrained natural desires in favor of duty or divine commands, Spinoza's approach identified the natural conditions that supported genuine human flourishing and demonstrated why behavior that promoted such flourishing was both individually satisfying and socially beneficial. This naturalistic approach to ethics avoided the psychological conflicts that plagued traditional moral systems by showing that rational self-interest, properly understood, was compatible with genuine concern for others' welfare. Since human beings were naturally social creatures whose individual development required appropriate social contexts, behavior that promoted social cooperation and mutual aid served individual interests while contributing to collective well-being. The analysis extended to specific moral questions about honesty, justice, courage, and other virtues that traditional ethics had often treated as arbitrary obligations or supernatural commands. Spinoza demonstrated that these character traits represented natural expressions of rational understanding applied to social relationships, and that they contributed to individual happiness while supporting social conditions that made such happiness possible for others. His treatment of negative emotions like fear, anger, hatred, and envy showed how these psychological states resulted from inadequate understanding of one's actual situation and interests. Instead of treating such emotions as moral failings that required punishment or suppression, he analyzed them as natural responses to perceived threats that could be modified through better understanding of their causes and more effective strategies for achieving genuine security and satisfaction. The ethics of joy also provided guidance for dealing with external circumstances that could not be changed through individual effort. Instead of raging against natural limitations or social injustices that were beyond personal control, rational individuals could focus their energy on developing whatever capacities remained available while working with others to create social conditions that supported human flourishing rather than perpetuating unnecessary suffering. Perhaps most importantly, this ethical system demonstrated that philosophical understanding was not merely academic exercise, but practical wisdom that could dramatically improve the quality of human experience. The rational analysis of emotions, relationships, and social arrangements that constituted Spinoza's philosophical work was simultaneously intellectual achievement and emotional therapy, providing both theoretical insight and practical guidance for living well. The integration of cognitive and emotional development that characterized his ethics of joy provided a model for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical knowledge and psychological wisdom. The same analytical approaches that could illuminate questions about metaphysics and political organization could also provide practical guidance for achieving emotional satisfaction and social cooperation under any circumstances that natural necessity might impose. The philosophical system that emerged from this ethics of joy represented one of history's most systematic attempts to demonstrate that rational understanding and emotional satisfaction were not competing goals, but complementary aspects of genuine human development. The lens grinder, who had been exiled from his religious community for his intellectual honesty, had discovered philosophical resources for happiness that were more reliable and more satisfying than anything that conventional social belonging could provide. 3.5 centuries after Spinoza's death, his influence on human consciousness continues to expand in ways that confirm his insight that genuine philosophical discoveries participate in eternal truth that transcends the particular historical circumstances of their original formulation. What began as the private reflections of an excommunicated lens grinder has become an integral part of humanity's ongoing effort to understand reality, manage emotions, and create social conditions that support genuine human flourishing. The academic institutionalization of his ideas through university philosophy programs has ensured that future generations of students encounter systematic rational analysis as a legitimate approach to fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and ethics. His works are now studied not as historical curiosities, but as living resources for addressing contemporary challenges that require integration of scientific knowledge with philosophical wisdom. The influence on contemporary scientific research has been particularly significant in fields that study the relationship between mind and body, individual psychology and social behavior, rational analysis, and emotional satisfaction. Neuroscience, cognitive psychology, systems theory, and other empirical disciplines have provided biological and social confirmation for insights that he developed through purely philosophical analysis. Perhaps most importantly, his demonstration that intellectual honesty and emotional health were compatible rather than competing goals has inspired countless individuals who faced conflicts between social conformity and personal authenticity. His example of choosing rational integrity over conventional belonging continues to provide guidance for people seeking to live according to their deepest convictions, despite social pressures toward conformity. The environmental movement has found in his identification of God with nature philosophical foundation for developing sustainable relationships with natural systems that recognize human dependence on ecological health, while acknowledging human responsibility for environmental stewardship. His systematic naturalism provides conceptual resources for addressing environmental challenges without retreating into either anthropocentric exploitation or romantic primitivism. Contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other technological developments that raise questions about human nature and social organization have rediscovered the relevance of his systematic approach to understanding the relationship between natural possibilities and ethical obligations. His analytical methods remain applicable to challenges that he could never have anticipated. The global circulation of his ideas through translation and cultural adaptation has created international philosophical discourse that maintains core insights about rational analysis while addressing diverse cultural contexts and historical circumstances. Thinkers working within different religious, political, and intellectual traditions have found in his methodological approaches tools for developing more sophisticated understanding of their own situations and possibilities. Educational institutions increasingly incorporate approaches to emotional regulation and stress management that reflect psychological principles he developed centuries before empirical research confirmed their effectiveness. Mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral interventions, and other evidence-based therapeutic approaches embody his insights about the relationship between rational understanding and emotional well-being. The development of complexity science and systems thinking in fields ranging from biology and economics to organizational management and urban planning has vindicated his insight that complex realities could be understood through systematic analysis of their underlying principles and causal relationships. His geometric method continues to provide analytical tools for understanding emergent phenomena in natural and social systems. Perhaps most significantly, his integration of metaphysical insight with practical wisdom has created philosophical resources that remain relevant for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and broader perspective on human values and social organization. His work demonstrates that rigorous rational analysis can support, rather than undermine, emotional satisfaction and social cooperation. The continuing relevance of his philosophical system suggests that his commitment to following rational arguments wherever they led, regardless of their implications for conventional thinking, identified principles about reality and human nature that transcend particular historical circumstances. His discoveries about the relationship between understanding and happiness, individual development and social cooperation, rational analysis, and emotional fulfillment continue to provide guidance for anyone seeking clear thinking about fundamental questions. The lens grinder's workshop, where these insights were first developed, has become a symbolic location for all subsequent efforts to achieve genuine understanding through patient, rational analysis rather than wishful thinking or authoritative pronouncement. The tools and methods he developed for grinding optical lenses became metaphors for the intellectual discipline necessary for achieving clear vision about reality and human possibilities. The man who died in quiet obscurity, known primarily as a dangerous heretic whose ideas threatened social stability and religious authority, has become recognized as one of history's most systematic and practical philosophers. His demonstration that extraordinary serenity was achievable through rational understanding rather than external circumstances continues to inspire people seeking authentic wisdom about how to live well under any conditions that finite existence might require. The eternal perspective that he achieved through philosophical analysis, the capacity to understand individual experience within comprehensive understanding of natural reality, remains available to anyone willing to undertake the intellectual and emotional work necessary for genuine wisdom. In this sense, his most important legacy is not any particular theoretical conclusions, but the demonstration that such wisdom is possible for finite beings embedded within infinite reality who are willing to think clearly about their actual situation and possibilities. The workshop in The Hague where Spinoza spent his final years grinding lenses and completing the Ethics has long since disappeared, but something of its spirit persists wherever human beings undertake the patient work of achieving clear vision about reality and their place within it. The tools he used to shape glass with mathematical precision have become symbols for the intellectual discipline necessary to understand oneself and one's world without the distorting effects of wishful thinking, traditional prejudice, or emotional attachment to comfortable illusions. We will never know whether his final moments brought him the perfect peace that his philosophy promised was achievable through complete rational understanding of one's situation and acceptance of natural necessity. But the serenity with which he faced decades of social ostracism, economic uncertainty, and physical illness suggests that he had discovered practical resources for happiness that were immune to external circumstances because they were based on internal development rather than external achievement. What remains most remarkable about his achievement is not any particular theoretical conclusion, but the demonstration that extraordinary intellectual and emotional integration was possible for someone willing to accept the costs and disciplines that such integration required. He proved through his own example that genuine freedom could emerge from understanding and accepting the natural necessities that constrain all finite existence, and that this freedom was more valuable than any form of liberation that depended on wishful thinking about supernatural rescue or cosmic purpose designed specifically for human benefit. The philosophical system that emerged from his patient analytical work has outlasted all the religious and political authorities that considered it dangerous to social stability and individual morality. His insights about the relationship between rational understanding and emotional satisfaction, individual development, and social cooperation, scientific knowledge, and ethical wisdom continue to provide guidance for addressing challenges that he could never have anticipated, but that reflect the same fundamental questions about how conscious beings can live well within natural reality. Perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated that the highest human happiness was compatible with complete intellectual honesty about the nature of existence and human possibilities. The same analytical rigor that revealed disturbing truths about cosmic indifference and human limitation also provided resources for achieving genuine contentment based on appreciation of the remarkable fact that consciousness was possible at all within natural reality governed by mathematical necessity. The lens grinder who found perfect freedom through understanding necessity, who achieved serenity by accepting what could not be changed while working patiently to understand everything that could be understood, who discovered infinite satisfaction within finite existence, lived according to reason, rather than hope. This figure continues to inspire anyone seeking authentic wisdom about how to live with dignity in a world that offers no guarantees, except the continuing availability of truth, to minds willing to seek it honestly. The infinite perspective that he achieved through philosophical analysis remains accessible to anyone willing to undertake similar intellectual and emotional work. In learning to see reality clearly, without the comfortable distortions that make most people miserable, we participate in the same eternal understanding that made his brief existence a permanent contribution to human consciousness. The workshop is gone, but the work continues, and the infinite horizon of possible understanding stretches before us as it did before him, not as a promise of final answers, but as an invitation to the only form of liberation that finite beings can achieve, the freedom that comes from understanding our actual place within the vast, beautiful, and utterly rational reality that contains us all.